Okay, so the Revolutionary War ends 1783. Those 13 colonies ruled by England are no longer ruled by England, and they become 13 states and form one nation, the United States of America. And last week you learned about some of the historical events that the United States of America went through shortly after it became a country, from the Constitution being written, the doubling of the size of our country with the Louisiana Purchase and the exploration of this new land, and of course back at war with England with the War of 1812. But believe it or not, less than 80 years after our country has fought to become this proud United States of America, our country begins to fight itself. And that's the definition of a civil war, when one country fights itself. And America will go through the American Civil War starting in 1861. And so that is going to be the next topic that we're going to be studying really for the remainder of the year, is this American Civil War, when the country that just fought so hard to become a country will be fighting itself. Now, you just spent a little bit of time thinking about compromises that you have made to try to keep peace between you and somebody else. And so what you're going to learn is how our country made some compromises to try to stop this civil war from occurring. Unfortunately, not all compromises can be made, and the civil war will begin. So what we're going to be doing is learning about some of the background that led up to this American Civil War. And you can see in this picture here, we have soldier versus soldier, and you can see that those soldiers, if you look at their faces, they look like they could be brothers. And that picture was purposeful in the sense that the American Civil War really was a war of brother versus brother, American versus American. So let's dive a little bit deeper and figure out how in the world this war came to be. So to do that, we need to kind of think about how our country grew from the time we became a country at the end of the Revolutionary War in 1783, when we started with 13 states, and how we grew from there. We know that today we have 50 states, but we started with only 13. And if you take a look at this map, our 13 original states was that land there in that yellow color. But when the United States of America became a country at the end of the Revolutionary War, yes, we were 13 states, but we also owned some additional land. It was called territory, and it's that land in purple. And that was land that we had won from I should say England had won from the French during the French and Indian War. So you can kind of see where we started when our country became a country. But over time, our country is going to grow. Now, we're going to focus on the growth, not to today, where we're 50 states, but to the time when the Civil War will begin. The Civil War will begin in 1861. And by the time the Civil War begins, we have grown from 13 states to 33 states. And you can see the map on the right. We have our 33 states kind of in that light gray color. But the United States of America also owns that additional territory in that darker gray color. We just haven't officially turned it into states yet. And it is the growth of this country from 13 states to 33 states that wasn't necessarily easy. It did require some compromise, because our goal was, in order to keep the peace in our country, we needed to keep a balance. So let me kind of explain that a little bit more. We needed to keep the balance between the number of free states in our country and the number of slave states in the United States. And just it's kind of Captain Obvious what those states are. Slave states are states that allow slavery. The law of the state says slavery is legal. And free states say the law says that you cannot have slavery in that state. And the goal as our country is growing is to always keep the number of free states and the number of slave states equal, because Congress, the people that make the rules and laws for our country, get votes on laws and decisions that are made for our country. And if there are more slave states in our country, then there are more slave states voting, and slave states have more power. Well, that makes the slave states happy, but it makes the free states angry. Vice versa, if there's more free states in our country, then Congress, of the free states in Congress, have more power in their votes than the slave states. And that, of course, would make the free states happy, but the slave states angry. And angry states can lead to war. So as our country is growing, we have this constant need to keep the balance. And that's not always going to be easy, and it is going to require compromise. Let me give you a couple of examples. Let's take the year 1820. In the year 1820, we have this lovely balance. There's 11 free states, 11 slave states. But Missouri decides that they want to join the United States of America, and they want to join as a new state, but as a slave state, which would change the number from 11 to 12, which would give the slave states more states in our country. Well, of course, that would make the slave states happy, but that would anger the free states, and anger could lead to war. And so we do need to have a compromise. This compromise is called the Missouri Compromise. And you could probably figure out, if this were a situation that you needed to come up with a compromise for, you might be able to figure out how to make the free states happy. And that's simply to add a free state at the same time. And so what they decided to do is, while they're adding Missouri as a slave state, they decided to add Maine as a free state, changing the number of free states from 11 to 12. Well, there's that balance again. Both sides are happy, and we're good to go. And this need to keep the balance will continue as the United States of America grows. Let me give you another example. 1849, that year might sound familiar to you. At this time, we are nice and balanced. We have 15 free states, 15 slave states, but we have a pretty historical event, the California Gold Rush. They discover gold out west, and thousands upon thousands of people leave the East Coast and travel and flock to California. And really the rule to become a state back then is if you had more than 10,000 people living somewhere, you could file to become a state. And so in 1849, California says, listen, we'd like to become a state. And they had no need for slavery, so they wanted to become a free state, which would change the number of free states from 15 to 16. Well, let's go back to the Missouri Compromise. The compromise would be you add a free, you add a slave. Well, there wasn't any slave states at that time that wanted to join. And so we didn't have the opportunity to make that balance. And so if you kind of leave it like this, we are left with, yes, happy free states, but angry slave states, and that can lead to war. And so they needed to compromise. They called this compromise the Compromise of 1850. And basically, since they didn't have an additional state to add to make the slave states happy, they decided to keep the number of slave states at 15, but they added a law to our country. And this law favored slave states. It was called the Fugitive Slave Law. And this law was huge. It was put into place in 1850 with the Compromise of 1850, and it really changed things really forever for slaves. Before the Fugitive Slave Law, a slave in a slave state, if they managed to escape to freedom, they needed to make it to a free state to escape to freedom. Okay, that made slave states at risk of losing their slaves. The Fugitive Slave Law said that anyone caught helping a slave escape, helping a fugitive slave, could be punished by law, would be punished by law with fines, jail time. And so now a slave who's escaping can't just go to a free state anymore, because it was illegal for free states to harbor these fugitive slaves. And so if a slave wanted to escape, they needed to escape out of the United States of America, making it so very much harder for slaves to escape. So the Fugitive Slave Law really helped to protect slave owners from losing their slaves. And for a while, this compromise was enough that even though the balance wasn't there, it was enough to keep both sides happy. And so another compromise kept the peace. Now, if you take a look at the date 1850, the Civil War is going to start in 1861. This peace isn't going to be kept for long.